today to welcome Russell Mead and to hear him talk about his new book, Clarke, the Covenant, and specifically on the current crisis in Israel and U.S.-Israeli relations, certainly an issue that's of great interest to us at the present time. I will introduce my colleague Rachel Gordon in just a moment, but I want to tell everybody that after the Q&A, please stick around. We have a wonderful undergraduate reception, which we only do once a year. We're going to tell you about our programs, and in return, you'll get some wonderful things to eat. So please do stick around for that. But first, we have this wonderful talk. I want to introduce our introducer, the Samuel Bud Schorstein Professor of American Jewish Culture and Society, my colleague Rachel Gordon.
Thank you and welcome. I know many of you are here not only to hear Professor Russell Mead, but also to congratulate the winners of our Schorstein Writing Awards, which we'll mention after the talk today. As Professor Goda mentioned, today is made possible through the generosity of Schorstein, who has funded so many events that many of you have attended this year. It makes possible kind of gatherings, social gatherings for us. We're very grateful for his generosity. Our guest today, Professor Walter Mead, is the James Clarke Chase Professor of Foreign Affairs and the Humanities at Bard College and is Distinguished Fellow in American Strategy and Statesmanship at the Hudson Institute. In addition to his most recent book, which we'll be discussing today, The Ark of a Covenant, the United States, Israel, and the Faith of the Jewish People, Professor Mead is the author of several other books, including God and Gold, Britain, America, and the Making of the Modern World, Power, Terror, Peace, and War, America's Grand Strategy in a World at Risk, and Special Providence, American Foreign Policy, and How It Changed the World. He was the winner of the Lionel Gilbert Prize and nominated for the Arthur Ross Award. And he is also a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. We're so very glad to have him with us today.
Well, thank you, Rachel and Norman, for the introduction. And first of all, I can tell that I am with a group of real intellectuals today. And how do I know this? It's something that you learn if you do any public speaking, which is that when you're in a room full of people who think of themselves as students, basically, the front rows are as empty as possible. They will sit as far away from you as they can safely manage, while if this were some kind of press conference or something like that, you'd all be in the front rows with your notebooks out. So everyone here is in a learning mode, which is terrific. I was told, we talked a little bit about what I should do in this talk, and I asked, well, how long should I talk? And I said, well, University of Florida students, they're very serious people. Really, basically, the longer the talk, the better. I said, well, but how long? And he said, well, think of Fidel Castro at the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Revolution. 6 hours, 7 hours, you know, they feel that they really don't think they're getting their money's worth. I said, well, okay, but should I at least have lots of like funny anecdotes and practical illustrations? No, wants it theoretical and lots of abstract nouns. Try to use the passive voice as much as you can. So those were my marching orders. I have to say that I'm not actually, since all I have is a BA in English, I don't really have the professional standing to be able to give a talk like that. So I'm sorry, I'm going to have to do it the best I can. I've written a book on the U.S.-Israel relationship, and it's not a book, kind of unusually maybe, it's not a book with my secret peace plan in the Middle East. It's also not about who I think is right, the Israelis or the Palestinians. It's not about whether I think American foreign policy has been too pro-Israel, not pro-Israel enough. It's about none of those things. It's just trying to understand as much as possible what happened and why it happened, good or bad. When you think about it, it's impossible to write anything, to say that American foreign policy is always good when it's pro-Israel or always good when it's anti-Israel. Life just doesn't work out that way. It's also true, I think, that we have a temptation in foreign policy to sort of think that, okay, what foreign policy ought to be is the application in a very simple way of right and wrong to international affairs. So if you should decide that in your mind the Palestinians are basically right about their complaints about their case against Zionism and the Jewish state, then obviously the United States should side with them. Or alternatively, if you think that the Israeli Jews are correct, that Zionism is the legitimate national aspiration of the Jewish people, they have a historical claim to the homeland, therefore American foreign policy should always support them because they're right. This is not how things work, or even perhaps should work in foreign policy, because it might well be that everything that the most impassioned Hamas or Islamic jihadic orator says about Israel is true, and still, in order to maintain some kind of larger peace or American strategy in the Middle East, it might be necessary for the U.S. to side with Israel. Or on the other hand, it might be true that everything that the most impassioned ultra-Zionist, Bibi is too soft Israeli hardliner might say about the Arabs and the Palestinians is true. But even so, it might be necessary for American foreign policy to actually work with and maybe even support the Palestinians in the Middle East. So to think that what foreign policy is about is simply to decide in a specific case what is right and wrong and then have everything flow from that won't work. It wouldn't work, for example, if the United States said, okay, China is treating the Uyghurs badly, which it is, and therefore we should be doing everything in every place to oppose China that we can. This would actually be a form of madness, not of policy, because in fact there are many things going on. And just for example, a US-Chinese nuclear war would be bad for the Uyghurs as well as for everybody else. And so we have to bring more issues than just a specific moral case to the table when we're thinking about China. In the same way, we can't say, well, the Turks are mistreating the Kurds. That can't be the center of our Turkish policy because there are other things at stake. It can be immoral to make a very simple moralism the center of our policy anywhere. So that doesn't help me decide whether the U.S. should be pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian, but it does say this is complicated. So I'm sorry, it's complicated. So what I tried to do in this book was to get beyond some of those questions and ask some, what drives U.S. policy toward Israel? Why do we do what we do? And then a related question, why do we talk about it? Why do politicians and others talk about the relationship the way that they do? Because the first thing that strikes you as a student of international affairs about this relationship is that Israel is a very small country. And while it's a very powerful country in the Middle East, it is not America's most important ally. It is not our most important trading partner. It's not our most important source of investment or destination of investment. If you look at American national interests, Israel is much less important than a lot of other countries that get a lot less ink in the United States, or a lot less time on cable news, or for that matter, think about how at campuses all over the United States, the Israel issue is a major issue, right? It happens everywhere you go. Professors are doing teach-ins, students are marching, pro-Zionists are trying to get anti-Zionists canceled, anti-Zionists are trying to get pro-Zionists canceled. There's this intense interest in Israel and Israel policy. People who don't follow foreign affairs at all, and that is the overwhelming majority of Americans, often have very strong feelings about Israel, some pro, some anti. So Israel, as I say in the book, Israel occupies a speck on the map of the world, but it occupies a continent in the American mind. And so trying to understand why Americans from all different points of view think so much about Israel and care so much about Israel, again, pro or con, that's something that I wanted to understand. And given that too, what does drive American policy toward Israel? The State Department used to ask me, now that I'm a Wall Street Journal columnist, sad to say, I can no longer accept U.S. government money. It's a real tragedy. And I never got as much as I would have liked. Let me tell you, these State Department things, they don't pay well. But the State Department used to ask me to go to different countries around the world and give lectures on the history of American foreign policy, why America does the crazy things that we do, and so on. And what I would find when I would engage with international audiences, from very elite audiences to people kind of, from very much second and third tier colleges or even high schools, where we had to have interpreters because no one spoke English. When you ask them, people there would say, why do the Jews control America? Because that's their sense. They would believe that America has a pro-Israel policy, and that this is because American Jews are so powerful in the United States. And I've seen polls that show that in many foreign countries, they think that Jews are like 40% of the American population. All right. And this idea that somehow there is a Jewish lobby that controls American policy on Israel is something that you find all over the world, even among people in governments in other countries. I once spent a fascinating day in Jordan at a conference of professors and scholars, all Jordanian except for me, and the argument was, who controls America? And basically the people on the left said it was the oil companies, and the people on the right said it was the Jews. And that was the debate over American foreign policy, right? So I don't think, I wanted to look and see what's really going on, because when I look at American foreign policy, what I see is, for example, like in the 21st century, the two presidents who've been considered the most pro-Israel, right, would be George W. Bush and Donald Trump. Now you actually look, what did American Jews think of those two men? And you find that a very large majority of American Jews voted against George Bush in 2000 and again in 2004. And that furthermore, an enormous majority of money coming from Jewish donors went to Bush's Democratic opponents. And yet, not only globally, but even some people in the United States saw George W. Bush's policies in office as the expression of the power of the American Jewish community, their ability to dominate American politics. And in the same way, Donald Trump, who in some ways was, might be considered for some the most pro-Israel president in American history, I don't think any politician in the United States has been as cordially hated by as large a majority of the American Jewish population as Donald Trump. And you'll hear about a few very wealthy Jewish campaign contributors. The late Mr. Adelson is one of them, Sherman Adelson, who supported Trump. But the overwhelming majority of Jewish money that went into the campaigns of 2016 and 2020 went to Clinton in 16 and Biden in 20. If American Jews controlled the United States, Donald Trump would have never been president, George Bush would have never been president, and American policy would have taken very different turns. If American Jews controlled our policy, the American embassy would not be in Jerusalem, it would be in Tel Aviv. The United States, our policy would look much more like Barack Obama's policies. President Obama had the highest support of any modern American president among American Jews. In 2008, only black Americans voted for Obama in a higher percentage than American Jews. So the common explanation that when America does something pro-Israel, it's because American Jews are so powerful and so monolithically pro-Israel that their power prevails over everybody else doesn't hold up. And the fact that so many people believe such a version of history which has zero facts to uphold it, right? That tells me something anyway about the cultural power of a kind of an embedded, unconscious anti-Semitism. That is to say, the people who believe this aren't consciously hating Jews and wanting to think, well, Hitler might have not have been right about everything, but he wasn't wrong about everything. They're not. It's none of that stuff, and they're not even necessarily aware that they harbor anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic sentiments. But in the culture, as in other forms of cultural racism and culturally embedded prejudices, there are ideas about Jewish power, Jewish money, the Jewish political agenda that just kind of quietly, unconsciously propagate. And I think, to me, just as we all need to fight racism, Islamophobia, and many other kinds of unconscious or partially conscious prejudices that are there, the fight against anti-Semitism is something that we all need to engage in our communities, but above all, in ourselves, because it's there. In any case, so what does, if it isn't the Jewish community, what does drive American policy? I'd say, first of all, by the way, evangelical Christians do have more to do with it in some ways than American Jews. But even there, if you look, what percentage of Americans are white evangelical Protestants? You get to about 16 to 18%. But most polls will, and Jews are less than 3%, less than 2% actually. So you add 16 and 2 and you get 18, right? And actually not all of these groups are unanimous. But if you go to polls, you'll find generally that 50+ percent of Americans sympathize with Israel or support a U.S.-Israel alliance. Now, those polling numbers go up and down in response to events, but over the decades, there's been a kind of a slow but steady rising trend in that. Now, whether that will continue, I don't know. But in any case, all right, 18 does not equal 50. All right, so if we just say evangelical Christians plus Jews, we get to about 1/3 of the American support for Israel. And so to somehow think that, okay, those are the two forces that are driving the train here is, I think, to miss a lot about American politics. Okay, so what does drive American policy toward Israel? As far as I can tell, going back to when Israel emerged as a state, actually 75 years ago this spring, what has driven American policy, as opposed to American politics and American rhetoric, has been American interest. And what do I mean by that? I mean that each president comes into office with an understanding in his own mind of what America's interests are and what then should be our global strategy to achieve our interests. And then how does the Middle East fit into that overall strategy? And then where does Israel fit into our Middle East strategy? So if you look at what President Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and so on, how they thought about the world at large, how the Middle East fit into that picture, and how Israel fit into that picture, you'll actually get a much better, you'll be able to see why America did what it did much more clearly than with any other method. There are a lot of myths about this relationship. Most people, I find, especially most younger people, but not only, will think that the U.S. and Israel have always been allies. And they'll also think that Israel only became, in a sense that Israel kind of owes its existence and its prosperity and its strength to its American alliance. And so, by the way, if America chooses not to support Israel anymore, Israel will crash and burn fairly quickly, and therefore that America should have a lot of influence over Israel because they depend on us, and so they'd better listen to what we say. And that, this is the way a lot of people see the relationship. But if you look at it, actually the U.S. and Israel only really began to be partners in security and defense in about 1973. When Israel had already been independent for 25 years. When Israel was actually poor, weakly defended, filled with refugees, and surrounded by powerful enemies, the United States wanted nothing to do with it. We were, during President Eisenhower's time, we were much more interested in having an alliance with Egypt than with Israel. And Eisenhower actually plotted with the British to force Israel to give up the Negev, the southern desert in Israel, as a way of trying to please Nasser and the Arabs. So no, Israeli prime ministers were not welcome at the White House. And not only did we not give Israel military aid in those years, we wouldn't let Israel buy American weapons even for cash money. So when Israel needed friends and was poor and weak, the United States didn't help. When Israel won its independence, because the Soviet Union gave it weapons in 1948, not the United States. It won its war against Egypt and the Sinai in 1956 because it was given primarily French weapons. And again, it was French weapons in 1967 that helped Israel win the Six-Day War. And it was French technicians who gave Israel the aid that allowed it to build the nuclear bomb. The U.S. actually tried very hard to stop Israel from getting a nuclear bomb. The United States and Israel only begin to become allies in 1973 when Israel has established itself as the strongest military power in the region by winning the Six-Day War, beating Egypt and Syria and Jordan, and when Israel had nuclear weapons. The Nixon administration believed that Israel had achieved nuclear arms when it took power in 1969. So Israel did not become strong because it had an American alliance. It gained an American alliance because it had grown strong. And once Israel was a military superpower in the region, the Americans, when we had interests in the region, we saw Israel as a very natural partner. And I think, by the way, today, if the U.S. should wake up in the morning and just decide, you know what, we really don't want to be involved in the Middle East anymore, or we don't really want Israel as an ally, it's too much trouble, blah, 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 whatever reason, okay, Israel would not dry up and blow away. there would be countries lined around the block wanting to be Israel's new best friend, because Israel remains a nuclear power in a very important part of the world. Its tech industry and its extraordinary military technology make it a very desirable ally. There are a lot of countries that would kill, literally, to get access to cutting-edge Israeli technology, and maybe not only that, to find out what the Israelis know about our technology, which is quite a bit. Israel would not be short of allies if the United States decided we didn't want to do it. And this, by the way, means that the bargaining power of any American president over Israel is anything but infinite. We are not able to we're not able to extract the kinds of concessions from Israel that a lot of Americans would like to see us do. Not because the Jews control America and won't let us pressure Israel, but because the reality of international relations and the balance of forces is that you can only get what you can get. And in this case, it's not nothing, but it's not everything we would like. Okay, so in any case, we have seen, you can go back, you can read a history of American policy during the Cold War by someone like John Gaddis at Yale, who gives a terrific history. And if you try to fit our Israel policy into his analysis of the strategies of containment that we used in the Soviet Union, you'll find pretty much a clean match with our policies toward Israel all through the Cold War and indeed afterwards. So that's the big picture that drives, in my view, our policy toward Israel. What about then, the politics? Because we see a lot of presidents signal a lot about Israel policy. They talk a lot about Israel policy. You can hear President Biden saying, the bond is indissoluble. President Trump used it. Every president uses this. Why? I think it's because of this. Israel's political salience in American politics and culture is greater than its strategic importance in American foreign policy. As I say, it's a speck on the map of the world. It's a continent in our minds. So today, if President Biden decides that, oh my goodness, I'm getting too much heat from the left wing, they're really mad at me, if I'm not careful, maybe somebody on the left is going to run against me in the 24 primaries, and I don't want that to happen, what can I do? Well, one thing he can do is he can make a statement and say, we deplore what Israel is doing on the West Bank about X, and we believe that Palestinians should have equal rights to Israel. And a lot of people on the left who don't follow foreign affairs normally, who would fall asleep if he was giving a talk about the Kurds or even the Uyghurs or the Rohingya or a whole list of other people, were like, whoa, listen, Obama, he's really moving. Biden is doing something. Oh, I hope he does more. He's moving in our direction. This is great. But then on the other hand, if Biden decides, you know what, I'm getting tagged too much on the left and I need to move a bit toward the center and triangulate a little bit, he can make a statement and say, Israel has a right to defend itself against terrorism and we support that right. And all kinds of people on the right and in the center will say, that Biden, he really is an American after all. He really is a good president. He's standing for Israel. Now, may I point out that neither of these statements necessarily involves any change of foreign policy at all, of actual policy. They are statements. They don't cost money. You don't have to send troops. At the most, you might have your ambassador deliver a note to the foreign minister of Israel. Okay? It costs nothing, and yet it gives you a great political benefit at home. All right? Of course, presidents do this. They would be incompetent if they didn't. Israel policy is a way that American presidents can signal to the American public. And they know that people will receive this signal While if they make a statement about Bulgaria or the Democratic Republic of Congo, no one will care or notice. Maybe a tiny number of people, most of them in the State Department anyway. So it's one of the few avenues an American president has for giving the American people some kind of sense of where they're going. All right, now let me just give you an example. I think Trump taught a master class in political signaling over insignificant policy in his Israel policy. And let's just get into the background here a little bit. 1992, well, let me start first. As many of you may know, Israel declares that Jerusalem is its capital, but almost every country in the world maintains the embassy in Tel Aviv, which is the biggest city in Israel. It's a coastal city. It's not far from Jerusalem. You can get there in like 40 minutes if the traffic is good, but which it almost never is, but that's another story. But in any case, that's the situation. This is unique in the world. That is, it's normal in the world that a country's government tells the world where its capital is, and everybody sets up embassies in that capital. So, for example, in Brazil some years ago, their capital used to be Rio de Janeiro. Everybody wanted to be a diplomat in Brazil and go live in Rio for years and have a nice house and a life in Rio and the beach. And if you haven't been to Rio, go. It is well worth it. All right, but then Brazil decides, no, enough of that. It's a colonial city. We're going to have a new capital out in the middle of Brazil, i.e. the middle of nowhere. We're going to build it from scratch. The embassies whined and moaned. No one wanted to move to Brasilia. But if you go to Brazil now, all the embassies are in Brasilia, and most of the diplomats are kind of unhappy, but that's life, okay? Israel, no, they're in Tel Aviv. So 1992, Bill Clinton is running for office, and he's looking for ways to attack George H.W. Bush, and says, look at this. Israel says the capital is Jerusalem. We should recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Move our embassy. People vote for them. Then he gets into office, and amazingly, the embassy stays in Tel Aviv. It doesn't move an inch. All right? And then they've got a midterm election. They're worried, are they going to lose votes over this? So Congress passes a law. The U.S. embassy must be in Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. Hooray, hooray, hooray. The embassy, though, remains in Tel Aviv, because there's a little thing in the law that says we'll move it unless the president certifies every 6 months that it's not in the national interest to move the embassy to Jerusalem. And so every 6 months for the rest of his term, Clinton signs the waiver. The embassy stays in Tel Aviv. 2000, George W. Bush gets a little bit of revenge by attacking the evil Clinton-Gore administration for breaking the law and not moving the embassy to Jerusalem. It's a disgrace and a scandal and an outrage. And he gets elected. And then this will shock you, I know, but for the next 8 years, he signs the waiver every 6 months. The embassy stays right there in Tel Aviv. Barack Obama, running for president in 2008, actually goes to AIPAC and says, Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. Hooray, hooray, hooray. Obama gets elected. And another 16 waivers get signed all during his term. The embassy is still in Tel Aviv. Trump runs for office and says, I'm going to move the embassy to Jerusalem if I get elected. He gets elected, and then he starts moving the embassy to Jerusalem, starts the process. At which point, every Middle East expert in America, every diplomat, every former ambassador, every intellectual, every professor, a few exceptions, get out there and they say, If you do this, the Middle East will burn. This is the most terrible thing. There will be violence from one end to the other. It will be the destruction of the American diplomatic position forever. Trump moves the embassy. Nothing happens. In fact, instead, you get the Abraham Accords as Israel signs peace with more Arab countries than ever before. Now, this for Trump is perfection. Because Trump's whole idea of politics, his whole political message, at least as it looks to me, is he's basically saying he's the little boy in that old folk story, The Emperor's New Clothes. The little boy who stands up there and says, the emperor has no clothes, the emperor is naked. When all the great and the good are talking about the emperor's wonderful tailors and their wonderful that Trump is the only one who has the courage to tell you what everyone knows is true, that the American politicians lie. They will say anything to get elected, but they have total contempt for the voters. They have no intention of doing what they say. This is just chum they throw to you. And they will immediately and systematically and permanently violate all of their pledges, and that the American foreign policy and intellectual establishments and college professors and all those dumb people like that are totally ignorant humbugs who just want to make you feel stupid and bad and little, while in fact they know nothing at all. So Trump used this as a way to put his entire message across. All right? And part of Trump, I think part of his political talent, is he's able to get his opponents to play the roles he would like them to play in the dramas, the various political dramas. So his opponents end up acting like the caricatures of themselves that he wants them to do. So that is probably the greatest example in the, of how a president is able to use Israel policy to communicate with large numbers of voters who otherwise don't care about foreign policy. Well, I think what I'll do here at this point is just say a few words about why I think peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians is so hard, in spite of the fact that this is the greatest American diplomatic effort of our entire history. Is the diplomatic effort to try to get peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. We've spent more time on it, more presidents have traveled on it, more foreign leaders have come to America working on this than on anything else in our history. All right? And we're obviously no closer and perhaps farther away now from a peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. We haven't really gained any ground since 1990 when the whole thing started underway. So why? As I've looked at it, what I've found is, basically, again, a lot of people who look at it say, well, the reason they haven't had peace is fairly obvious, is because the Israelis won't give the Palestinians enough concessions. And then on the other side, you'll hear people say, well, the reason there's no peace is obvious the Palestinians are so stubborn and they won't agree. All right, so there's a kind of, each side, you have people in America blaming both sides for this. I actually, looking at kind of this conflict, not as a single thing all by itself and on its own, but in the context of world history and looking at similar conflicts that we see in other parts of the world. Actually, it's not actually that surprising that we haven't been able to solve this. These are hard, okay? And what do I mean by that? Well, first, if you look at a modern map of Europe and the Middle East, you see like 50 or 60 independent countries there. If you went back and you looked at like 1870 or so around then, and you looked at that same area, you'd see like 5 countries. You would see the Russian Empire, which includes a ton of countries that are now independent, or in Ukraine's case, trying to stay independent. And you would see the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which included a lot of the Balkan countries and countries like the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, All right, and you'd see the Ottoman Empire, which included almost all the Middle East under one emperor, and you would have, and you had like small country of Greece and the German Empire. All right, today you look at that, those multinational, multi-ethnic, multi-religious empires basically all broke up in the 80 years between 1870 and 1950 into like a huge number of smaller, tended to be ethnically homogeneous countries. And in that process, something like 150 million people were killed, and maybe 30 million people were driven from their homes. There was genocide, was ethnic cleansing, Greeks against the Turks. We can still see some of that in Cyprus today. Bulgarians and Macedonians and Serbs and Kosovars, as we've seen in the last 20 years, but Hungarians. And the problem was all of these different ethnic groups wanted independence, but each of them had a different map in their head of what the world should look like. And you'll still hear people talk about things like I want greater Hungary, which basically means I want a piece of yours. Putin's idea for Russia is that it needs to include, Russia can't be Russia unless it has most, if not even all, of Ukraine, etc. These are not new. This is what politics has been about for over 100 years there. Okay, what makes for peace in these conflicts between these nationalities? Basically, when a stronger power forces them both to accept a status quo. So, for example, the Azeris and the Armenians and the Turks were doing a lot of fighting early in the 20th century. The Russians come in, the Soviets come in, and basically Azerbaijan and Armenia are both under the Soviet Union. And for like the entire lifetime of the Soviet Union, they don't fight with each other. Why? Because if they tried it, the hammer would come down from Moscow and they'd all go to the gulags. All right? So, but then the Soviet Union collapses. They immediately resume their independence and they very quickly start fighting with each other, as they were doing even last year. Or in Yugoslavia, they were all at peace while Tito was there ruling it. But when he died and Yugoslavia broke up and the wars between the Serbs and the Croats, wars in Bosnia, wars between the Kosovars and the Serbs, they all popped right up again. All right. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict at a certain level is one of these conflicts. They tend not to end because both sides agree, oh, this is a fair solution to our problem. Because each side has a different idea of what's fair. And sometimes even different principles that should judge what fairness is. So, in a sense, when the U.S. was really powerful, almost all powerful in the Middle East in the 1990s, that's when they came closest to a settlement. And as American power weakened, partly because I think of the mistakes we made and the policies we were following in Iraq and so on under Bush, and then again Obama trying to get out of the Middle East, we've been steadily reducing our power in the Middle East. And the peace process has lost energy with every step of that process. And my guess is that it would take, again, maybe it's China in the future, maybe it's something else, but these conflicts almost never end with the two sides saying, okay, fine, this is a fair split, let's live with it. So that's one thing. But it's even another thing that makes this one even harder is that caught up in this is a larger sense of conflict between Islam and the West. And the idea, and so for many people in the Islamic world, Israel represents a kind of a Christian intrusion into Muslim space. And we say, oh, that's so ridiculous. The Crusades ended 800 years ago. No, religious war was a big part of European history right up into the 20th century. Wars between Russia and the Ottoman Empire were seen as wars of religion by both sides. The wars of independence of the Balkan states, where Christian majorities overthrew their Muslim rulers, were seen as wars of religion on both sides. And when the Christian Bulgarians won, the Muslims in Bulgaria mostly had to flee. Something like 5% of the people in Turkey today are descended from Muslim refugees who fled these wars of ethnicity and religion in 19th century Europe. The Crimean War, the reason the Crimean War, not our current Crimean War, but the Crimean War of the 1850s, the original cause of it was fights between Catholic and Orthodox monks in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and the desire of the French to back the claims of the Catholic monks and the Russians to back the claims of the Orthodox monks, as for both of these countries part of their larger Middle East things. So religious war never went away. We know in America that Russian policies drove about 2 million Jews west, as Russian pogroms, anti-Semitism, and the large majority of American Jews today are descended from Jews driven out of the Russian space by deliberate anti-Semitism by Russian rulers. But roughly the same number of Muslims were driven south from Russia. And they came down through the Caucasus into the Middle East. There are lots of people, Muslims in the Middle East today, who fled Russia. There were genocidal Russian attacks on Islamic peoples in the Caucasus in the 19th century, seen again as wars between the cross and the crescent. So, it is, and by the way, when the Turks did well, they did massacres of Christians in retaliation. So it was kind of on both sides, these wars of religion. And so this conflict still has a resonance in the Islamic world as a war of religion. And of course, some of the Christians in America who back Israel tend to do so, as part of their motivation, maybe their fears of Islam and seeing a conflict between Christianity and Islam. It's not over. So you have ethnic conflict that almost never gets solved amicably. On top of that, civilizational conflict, so to speak, between some Muslims and some Christians. But then you have another issue, which it causes huge problems all over the world, wherever it happens. As I'm sure many of you know, in the 19th century, the 1800s, a lot of the world was ruled by empires of various kinds. The French Empire, the French ruled like Indochina, Vietnam, and so on. The English ruled India. Most of Africa was carved up. Well, one of the things that these European, and by the way, the Ottomans did this too, is they encouraged or allowed free immigration among their different subject nationalities. So when Burma became independent in 1948, I think that was the year, they actually had huge numbers of non-Burmese living there. Indians, a lot of them were Indian, because the British would bring, when they were all part of the British Empire, the British brought Indian civil servants to kind of do the office work for them in Burma. And the native Burmese had like the lowest level jobs. But like native Burmese were only like 20% of the population of Yangon, the capital, under British rule. And the Burmese come in and they start throwing out all the people who came in under British rule, feeling like, look, this isn't legitimate. We never consented to their immigration. And so the presence of these people here in our country is a violation of us. All right? And you find this, and that, by the way, with the Rohingya today in Burma, they generally are people who came down from what is now Bangladesh when it was all part of the British Empire. And so they might have been there 100 years or more, but in the eyes of many Burmese, this is a travesty. In Malaysia, where the British encouraged and allowed large numbers of Chinese to settle, so that now Malaysia is like 40% Chinese origin and 60% Malay origin. Tensions between the Chinese and the Malays are like the dominant thing in Malaysian politics. And Malaysia is one of the most anti-Israel countries on the face of the earth because they kind of see in the Palestinian resistance to the British allowed migration of Jews, they see exactly what they experience with the Chinese migration in there. While in Thailand, where you had a large Chinese migration at around the same time, the fact that Thailand was independent and their own kings allowed it, yeah, there's tension between Thai ties and Chinese ties, but not like in Malaysia or not like... All over the world, Fiji, politics are divided between the native Fijian islanders and Indian immigrants who came in under the British Raj. In East Africa, when they became independent, they drove out hundreds of thousands of Indians, Indian Indians, many of whom had lived there for generations under the British Raj as traders. When Egypt became independent, it not only expelled its Jewish population, it expelled Christian Greeks and others who had settled there during British and Ottoman times. So the desire of the resistance of people to imperial immigration is one of the factors that not only fuels Palestinian rejection of Israel, but fuels sympathy for the Palestinian rejection of Israel in other countries based on their own history and feelings. So with all of this, to me, it's just not surprising that this has been difficult and will be difficult. All right. So those are my thoughts on a couple of things. Do I have any quick takeaways that we could use in our lives today? Well, I suppose the big one I have is that Americans see Israel, as many other people do, in terms of identity politics, more than as a question of statecraft. So you'll find Palestinian Americans, and there are quite a few of them, will sort of, want, like all other Americans, to bring the ideas that they bring with them from home into the American debate. And so the attitudes toward Israel that are common in the Palestinian community, they want to express them in American politics. And they don't want to be told it's un-American to do that, because there's nothing more American than bringing the politics of your homeland, your original home, into your new home. We all do it. The Irish Americans, everybody does it. So why shouldn't they? And that's part of it. Part of it is that for many Americans, Israel has always stood out. Maybe I'll end on this note, after saying that many black Americans historically were among the most Zionist of Americans. Martin Luther King and most of his associates were some of the most committed Zionists. In fact, even very left-wing black activists used to be passionately pro-Israel. Paul Robeson was a member of the American Communist Party and a great artist who suffered tremendous persecution both for being black and for being communist, a bad career move in the early 1950s. Both of those together were really bad. But he not only was pro-Israel, he was pro-Irgun, which was the radical Jewish militia that was the most militant and was fighting the British and fighting for Jewish independence. He actually performed at concerts to raise money for weapons for Jewish terrorists. Okay, so there was the left actually being pro-Israel in America used to be a left-wing cause rather than a right-wing cause. And the Democrats were much more pro-Israel than the Republicans. And the Democratic Socialists of America saw Israel as the poster child of successful socialism. Because when people would say, oh, you can't be socialist and be a democracy, Israel, they would say, Israel, which was easily the most left-wing Western country in those days, with more state planning, more of a socialist economy, and a socialist culture than any of the European center-left countries. They'd say, well, look, Israel is very socialist and it's a democracy. And look, Israel is very socialist and it's strong enough to defend itself. So it shows that a socialist country can be democratic and strong on defense. So stop dissing socialism. Israel shows we're right. And you would not find that as a democratic social DSA talking point today. All right? So there's been a little slippage there. But anyway, today more black Americans might identify, again, the polls are interesting on this. Black Americans, by the way, tend to be more pro-Israel than Western Europeans of any ethnicity. So it's it's complicated. But you'll find a number of black Americans who'd say, hey, we're like the Palestinians, a minority that's oppressed, and we identify with their drive for statehood and dignity. And talk about Israel as an apartheid state, raises that sense. So people who are pro-Israel and people who are anti-Israel are often really saying something about themselves or come at this issue through their understanding of who they are and what their roots are. That's not going to go away. And I think Israel is going to remain a much more contentious topic in American politics. The other thing is it says, I don't think Israel's survival ultimately depends on the United States. I think it depends on Israel, as it has done since 1948. And if the United States walks away, Israel will find a way to survive. And if the United States stays as an ally, Israel will find a way to survive. In either case, I think Israeli politics is going to be very contentious. But I will close finally, and I know I'm almost getting to the 6-hour mark here. You've been very patient. I'll close with why I think there is such an enduring emotional sense about Israel among so many Americans. Not fundamentalist Christians, not Jews particularly, but that large number of Israel supporters who don't belong in the 18%. And that is, let's think about what the 1940s were like for Americans. 1944, the Soviet troops break into Poland and start liberating the extermination camps. Auschwitz and these places, Treblinka. And before that, people had known that the Holocaust was going on, that the Nazis were committing absolutely unspeakable crimes against the Jews. But it's one thing to sort of read a newspaper account or something like that. It's something else to see newsreel footage, interviews with survivors, and you can be absolutely sure that the Red Army did its absolute best to get all of the anti-Nazi pictures out of there that it could. They were really highlighting this, gave Western press every opportunity to photograph this. Don't look at me killing Poles over there. Look at what the Nazis did, was their view. And it was highlighted. Now, at the time, people didn't primarily think of this necessarily as a crime against Jews, but as a crime. That is, it was part of World War II, where there was mass murder on every side. This was an aspect of Nazi criminality, and in some ways the acme, the peak of it. But the message to a lot of people was, you know what? The Enlightenment was wrong. The Enlightenment, going back to 1700s, the idea that, hey, humanity used to be terrible. We used to murder each other. We used to be cruel. We used to have mean laws. We used to have unjust societies. People used to be bad. But that was because they were ignorant and poor. But now we have science and technology and schools. And so now we're going to be better. We're not just like making the externals of our life better. There's moral progress inside us. And so the new world is going to be better. Science and technology are making human nature good. And that idea is kind of fundamental to a lot of the optimism of the American liberal tradition. And probably for most of us, it plays a role in our thinking. But now we see Germany was the most enlightened country in Europe by many standards. The culture, the philosophy, the science, the schools. It was amazing, an amazing place. And those people, all of that had not protected against this Nazi disease that had turned them into a nation of soulless, cold-blooded killers and utterly ruthless people who were committing crimes that would bring shame to cavemen. You know, so the Enlightenment is a fraud. And that's a pretty terrifying thing to think about. 1945, what do we have? What do we get in the news? Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This species, these human beings who we just discovered are as evil and nasty and heartless and criminal and stupid and greedy as they've ever been, now have the power to destroy themselves. Okay, that's not good news. All right? We are morally horrible and backward and can't change, and we have nuclear weapons that could blow us all up. I would suggest to you that those two terrible facts, like two burning torches, kind of stand at the entrance to the world we all still live in today, where human beings who can't be trusted have power that could exterminate us and maybe all life on earth. And that fear remains a real part of our politics and our culture and our individual lives in ways that we don't often think about but are really there. Think about fears of climate change as another way, of fears that humanity's incompetence, selfishness, and greed might destroy us all. We all live with this now. But then 1948, against the odds, the Jewish state emerges. Now in America, the Christian majority, there was 300 years of teaching, biblical teaching by American clerics, that the Bible prophesies that as history moves toward a terrifying climax, the Jews will return to the Middle East, that God will bring the Jews back to the lands of the Bible. And then it happens. If you look at Billy Graham's preaching and the preaching of that whole generation, they don't talk about the, like Left Behind and some of this very crazy apocalypticism, but they look at the survival, the miraculous emergence of Israel after the Holocaust and everything else as a sign that God, the big guy upstairs, is still in charge. That the Bible, okay, right, fine, we have these scholars now, they say maybe it wasn't all dictated, and the prophet Isaiah, there might have been 5 different people, and instead of being written in one document, it's written over 150 years by different people, fine, but none of them wrote after 1948, all right? This book that is 2,500 years old tells you what's happening in front of you. And that sense of Israel, the existence of Israel being connected with a message of hope for humanity as a whole that was consonant with the deepest religious, cultural roots of the American people, I think continues in various ways to reverberate through American life and culture today, and creates a kind of a natural disposition among people to think that Israel is good and to be glad that it's there. So maybe at that point we can stop for questions, answers, anything else.
Great, thank you so much. I think I could have enjoyed
Hi. So one thing that you brought up that I thought was really interesting is you bring up the idea that U.S. politicians kind of overstate their support of Israel and kind of inflate kind of the way that the U.S. is vital to Israel's survival for their own political gain. When you kind of look at the history of the Israeli government, you look at, for example, Netanyahu coming to the U.S. to speak at the State of the Union in 2014 as the Republican rebuttal. You do, in a sense, kind of also have Israeli politicians and Israeli government figures kind of doing something similar in a sense, kind of legalizing. Do you see that at all? The Israeli government kind of playing into that for their own benefit?
Yeah, oh yeah. Look, I would say it's a general rule that political leaders in both democratic and non-democratic societies, one of the main things they try to do with foreign policy is to undergird their political strength at home. And for example, one of the things that you see foreign leaders, everyone is interested in having these summits, G7, G20, I don't know, G19, G23 plus 2, ASEAN, summits. All right. One of the reasons is because all of the leaders there feel they benefit by walking around with their fellow world leaders. And here's a picture, now I'm talking to the Chancellor of Germany and the President of Russia. I'm a big deal. Not like those scummy opposition politicians running around at home. So the use of foreign policy as kind of photo op or signaling device is one of the things that happens everywhere. It's one of the reasons, I believe, by the way, that some of the so-called realists who think that internal politics don't matter for foreign policy can overstate their case, because politicians really do think it matters.
Thank you.
Yes.
Prior to Israel being founded in 1948, was there any other issue that American presidents or presidential candidates used to be that almost virtue signaling or easy political credit? And looking forward, if there is a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in any regard, do you think there would be a new issue that presidential candidates would be able to take advantage of? Or do you think it's specific to the underlying religious notions, and that's why the Israeli topic is used to read?
Well, I think there may not be one that is as easily used. And actually, this conflict was used for political signaling in the U.S. even before there was a Jewish Zionist movement. President Benjamin Harrison in like 1893 was peacefully sitting in the White House doing whatever presidents do. Might have been trying to hide the fact that he was smoking from his wife. But the Secretary of State came in with a petition that Benjamin Harrison use his prestige to get the Europeans, to get the Ottoman Sultan to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. This petition was signed by John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the editors of the major U.S. newspapers, none of whom were Jewish. The American Jewish community wanted nothing to do with this petition. They hated the idea of this petition. But the sort of American establishment was Zionist before there was a Jewish Zionist movement. And in fact, if you go to Jerusalem today, you can visit a very charming hotel, the American Jewish Colony Hotel. This thing was originally, a group of Americans thought that if the Jews would go to Israel and start farming and live in a democratic way, then the Jewish nation would revive. All right? And so they actually went over, they bought land, they had this building, and they tried to persuade Jews in Jerusalem to go out and start farming. They did not have a lot of success. It's like, I don't want to farm, I want to study Torah. I didn't come here to farm and it's hot, and I could have stayed in Lithuania if I wanted to farm. But this was, but they tried. So this impulse in America to see Zionism as a good thing antedates Jewish Zionism in its modern form.
Okay, well, Professor Mead will be with us during our reception. We want to move then to awarding our undergraduates. Thank you.
say.